Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's World Affairs Council Great Decisions series. My name is Douglas Kinchy. I'm the director of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, and it's our privilege to be a sponsor of tonight's event. The World Affairs Council has been a good friend to Grand Valley State University and to the Kaufman Institute. We have done cooperative programs with them in the past, and we are pleased to be a part of that this evening. Dixie and Madonna suggested I say a few words about the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, but I'm sure that many of you are already aware of what we're doing. The Kaufman Institute was established in 2010, and in 2012 we had our Year of Interfaith Understanding with over 300 events throughout the community in sponsorship with 8 colleges, universities, and seminaries in the area, including Aquinas College and Calvin and Cornerstone and other educational institutions here in the community. We also had partnerships with many community organizations, including World Affairs Council, the Symphony Economic Club, and museums in the area. And also, we're very pleased that this year, 2015, is our Year of Interfaith Service. We are moving from talk to action, from understanding to service. And so we are continuing this effort to bring the various religious communities, as well as the secular community, together in our community to support each other and to support the needs for service in this area. Anyway, we're happy to be co-sponsors. Also, WGVU is one of the sponsors of this series, and then, of course, another Grand Valley organization. And for our corporate sponsor, it's the Sound Off Signal. And is there a representative from Sound Off here? Would you stand, please? We want to thank you very much for your sponsorship. As has happened for previous events, there is going to be an after session with Kathy Dopp. The Expats and Cultural Explorers group will meet following this discussion. We'll be meeting tonight at the Shesko Mediterranean Grill. That's right next to Celebration Cinema North. So if you'd like to continue the discussion that you hear this evening with others who have been part of this, please join that group for food and reception. There's no charge except for whatever it is you order. I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's topic and tonight's speaker. Sebastian Mazel is the Associate Professor of Arabic and Middle Studies at Grand Valley State University. He holds his PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies and Anthropology from Leipzig University. His research focus has been on the identity and cultural changes among minority groups in the Middle East. He's conducted extensive field work in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. His publications include many scholarly works as well as a number of books in Arabic, Middle East, and a 2-volume encyclopedia on Saudi Arabia. He's been a media consultant with Al Jazeera, with AP, with LA Times, and the Foreign Affairs, and he's right here a member of our West Michigan community. So tonight's topic is important for us to understand what's going on in the world. What could be more important than understanding better what's happening in the Middle East? So tonight he'll be speaking to us, is it religion or politics that divides the Middle East? So please welcome a good friend, a colleague, and an expert in this, Dr. Sebastian Mazel.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Great. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. And from the introduction, you probably heard that this is a long journey for me to come from Leipzig, from Germany, all the way here to West Michigan. And I want to shed light on some of the steps in the process and the way what got me from being a graduate student of anthropology of Middle Eastern affairs, and then a couple decades later, talking about these issues with some sort of authority or expertise. You probably heard that I spent some times in Middle Eastern countries, in Syria. I went to school to the University of Damascus, for example, when it was still safe to go and good to study, and later moved to Saudi Arabia to teach at institutions there and to work on my PhD, on conducting my field work on the Bedouins, the tribal groups of Saudi Arabia. So I feel like I've seen a lot experienced a lot on the streets and in the fields and in the lands of Middle Eastern states, and I talked a lot to people in the cafes, in the offices, and government officials. And I think over the years I developed an expertise or got a good ear to learn what's important for people in the Middle East. Actually, what is their take on the story? And in my classes and my research, I try to connect that story from the Middle East with our perception here, what we think actually is going on in the Middle East, what we get from the media, and it's a distorted view, as we all know. It's an abbreviated view, but through this opportunities like this, where I can communicate, interact with you, I hope I can shed some light on the other side of the story, the other view, what people from Syria think about, if this is actually a sectarian conflict that they're in, if this is a political thing, or if it's more than that. And I will start with a few reminiscences about the good old days when we thought the Middle East was easy to understand. At that time, and this is it's a fairly recent picture, although many of the people in the photo actually retired or deceased, but you recognize some of the former leaders, Mr. Zaid bin Ali from Tunisia, Ali Abdullah Saleh from Yemen. Here is Mr. Gaddafi from Yemen, Mubarak from Egypt, Omar Musa from the Arab League. The recent picture was taken probably in about 2009, when things were stable and we thought we knew what was wrong and right. We had our alliances, similar to the good old Cold Day War, when we had Cold War, and we know exactly who was with us and who was against us. Things have changed, and today we will learn actually what are some of the reasons, some of the driving factors for this change, and we will see that stability is no longer our greatest concern. Here, pick a few of those conflicts, and I marked those that I thought had some sort of sectarian undertone, but there are political conflicts, economic conflicts, there are social conflicts. The Middle East is ripe, is filled with conflicts, and we hear that in the media on and on and on. If you turn NPR, if you go to any other media outlet, 4 out of 5 news items are about the Middle East, and it's about conflict. So we hear very little positive news from the area. And actually, I made that part of the deal in my classes when we update each other on current events, that I tell my students, please find me something positive from the Middle East, not just negative news. But you see that we have, as I said, the red ones is all about religious fighting. We have some political fighting. We have some ethnic fightings as well. And trying to understand here who is with us, who is against us, is a goal what I'm trying to accomplish tonight, to walk you through this complex system of identity in the Middle East, Middle Easterners, what they think about who is right, who is wrong, who is with them, and who is against them. And then hopefully by the end of this talk, we get a better understanding or an answer to that question, if it's sectarian or political. Or maybe I should give it away, the answer. I say it's neither. So we will learn, we will see. I know you're all familiar with the map, with political system, with the system of states, with the system of political boundaries, and they were all created rather recently. So what we have here is a number of countries that do have a long culture and a long tradition, also a long tradition in governing their societies. But the states that we're looking at the map right now are rather young, even younger than America. So which is in the European context always an important argument that we're talking about something young, a young state that doesn't have experience in governing their people. But you see countries like Iraq, founded in 1920, not even 100 years old. Countries like Egypt, with these current borders, established in 1880. Libya, even younger, so this is much more recent creation. We have some ancient cultures that developed into nation states like Iran, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia. But as some sort of a bottom line here, we need to remember that political borders are artificial and new, and they don't have much historical depth. Now, if we compare that political map with what's going on the religious, on the sectarian side, we also note that these two things do not overlap. We see, for example, the dominance of Islamic groups. Yes, we know that that's a given, but we also see that there is a diversity in terms of even within Islam. There's diversity within Christianity. There's diversity among other religious expressions. There are even non-monotheistic groups in the Middle East, and I will talk about them a little later. But please note that political borders do not match sectarian borders, religious borders, and there is some sort of an given conflict already, an inbred conflict between the two. Things started to change recently. And when we looked at the picture from 2009, when we seen the dictators were still enjoying each other, enjoying themselves at this African Union summit, but shortly after, in 2010, 2011, we learned about a wave of change. We learned about the Arab Spring. And you've seen this, look at this little cartoon here that I found. That was about 4 or 5 years ago when we learned the Arab Spring just was the most exciting thing, and everyone was behind it. The youth demonstrated. We learned that old oligarchies fell, new political ideologies were born. And then a couple of years later down the road, we will learn that the Arab Spring actually turned into an Arab fall, an Arab autumn, and no hope that it will ever be reborn. You might remember this guy here that was eternalized on this stamp from Tunisia, Mohamed Bouaziz, this street vendor who exemplified the struggle of a typical low-class Middle Easterner who stood up against the authorities, and then through his action, through his sacrifice, was actually able to trigger a movement that led to the fall of an entire regime in the case of Tunisia. And then we learned that this movement quickly spread to other countries in the Middle East as well. We heard about the events in Egypt. And if you just have a quick look here at the different color coding of the map, you learn about that there are certain countries express their understanding of the Arab Spring through revolutions. Others did civil war. Others just protest. But we all hear that there's regime change involved. There's a new ideology being born. And in some countries, actually, it reverted back to the old days. But in many ways, it was something new. It was something exciting. And the masses participated. When masses participate in regime change, that is some sort of the opposite of the end of what we want in terms of stability. And that's why perhaps the response from Western nations was so slow in terms of supporting these grassroots movements for change. Here are just a few things. I have to plug that in. I'm an educator, I'm a professor, so I need to lecture on some of these things as well that we want to learn, that we want to keep, and when we analyze these changes, we say that important things, institutions have changed through this wave of demonstrations, through this wave of clashes, of revolutions. So they brought down regimes that have been in place for generations sometimes. Going back to the picture that you've seen, these were some of the rulers. They have been in place almost as long as Fidel Castro. And we know he was probably one of the longest standing rulers. The guy from Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, he was in charge in his country for about 3 decades. Mubarak came to power in the 80s. Gaddafi, 1969. Anybody been born before 1969? So when he already rose to power in Libya. So they provided stability. They provided funds. They provided resources. They established a relationship with the rest of the world that we relied on. We relied on their resources. We relied on their support. And it was some sort of a mutual coexistence. But these things all were shattered when the people started to march in the street. And here's a misconception that we might hear from all these talk about revolution, about regime change. Mr. Bouaziz from Tunisia, he didn't burn himself, he didn't immolate himself because he was fed up with the political system. We say that the Arab Spring was, in the beginning, an expression of grievances against the economical system. So we see a huge disparity between those who have and those who have not. And in particular in Middle Eastern countries like Tunisia, like Egypt, we see there's an elite and there are the masses who have little ways of raising in the ranks or actually prospering or improving their livelihood because of that stable political regime in charge. But then as soon as the revolt and the rebellion, the revolution turned violent, then there were political undertones as well. But other things were discussed or were brought up as well. Talk about new ideologies. All of a sudden, think about what happened in Egypt, for example, when we have a stable, semi-secular regime in power, and then all of a sudden, we have a president from the Muslim Brotherhood, unheard of. So changes, profound changes in the political system and also in the religious orientation of these countries. So important things happened during their time. Non-state actors played an important role. The youth movement, some call it even a high-tech revolution that was based on Facebook and Twitter and the social media that helped organizing all of these protests. And sectarian trenches have been reopened. Because one of the reasons why many of those Middle Eastern nations that were so stable, were so successful and so prosperous for so many years was their ability to keep down sectarian tensions. Not always in a good way, but they succeeded in establishing some sort of a totalitarian, authoritarian regime where allegiance and loyalty to the state was not expressed through religious terms. A good example would be Syria here in this case. But as a final outcome of the Arab Spring, we noted that states, the institution of the state in the Middle East, in general, became much weaker than before. And now we struggle with that concept when the state, as being the most dominant force of allegiance and loyalty in the past, has vanished or has been weakened, and people were looking for other forms of support, loyalty, or allegiance. There are some themes that we can determine as the outcome of the Arab Spring. As we said earlier, the institution of a nation state is something new in the Middle East, but nevertheless, I mean, people know how to govern their affairs in Middle Eastern societies for millennia, so this is not new, but this type of semi-secular authoritarian presidential regime is something that was rather new, and people had to learn to adjust to it and live with it. We also need to recognize the cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity of those countries. None of them are actually homogeneous in terms of their ethnic or religious affiliation. All of them have a majority and a minority in terms of the ethnic composition or the religious composition. In some cases, there's even what we call a reversed rule of the minority over the majority. Just say Syria or Bahrain. External influences. We need to talk about external influences in terms of foreign policies, of alliances, that actually get some of my colleagues to speak about a new Cold War in the Middle East, where we have certain camps emerging, and all these camps rallying around two important actors, two important players, most notable Iran on the one side and Saudi Arabia on the other. And how does the role of religion play in all to that? What I want to do is I want to walk you through the idea of identity in the Middle East. And I got some help because we're all familiar with this concept. When we describe identity in the Middle East, and well, here it's a problem that I call myself an area expert and have very little knowledge about other areas in the world. But if I talk about the Middle East and I describe identity, I use that image of the onion. I didn't steal it from Shrek, but it's something that probably makes you better understand, or we can illustrate the issue of a person's identity when we think about layers. Right? Every person has layers, and there's something at the outer layer, there's some inner layers, and there's a core. And if we want to understand what people really think about the events in the Middle East, then I think it's important to learn about the core identity in the Middle East, of Middle Easterners. And here's a model that has been used to explain these things among anthropologists in the Middle East. It's a traditional model that was established before the Arab Spring, but in many ways we can still use it because what we see now people doing under these circumstances, under these often violent circumstances, actually go back to their core, refer to their core identity, and leave out some superficial layers of identity that have not been well established over the past generations. So when we say the core of identity is not politics, it's neither religion, it's always blood, it's your family, who you belong to, and your extended family, that might be a larger group of kin, a larger group of relatives that forms a tribe. And a tribe, some might say, is a very ancient word to describe a 21st century society. But at the end, what we do is, what we see right now in the Middle East, actually people going back to that level of tribal identity in order to seek protection and support. And the best example for that is the Libyan case. Syria as well, and Iraq as well. But knowing your relatives, knowing your extended relatives, is a matter of life and death. Because you need their support, because the other loyalties, the other levels of identity do not provide for the same security and safety anymore. So we usually say it's blood, it's the place where you live and where you grew up, and it's faith. Faith does play a certain role, but it's not the core. It's an inner layer, but certainly other forms of identity play a more important part in that. Something is missing on that level. So when you think about blood, the region where we live, the religion, there's something else that's not mentioned on this, and it's from a Middle Eastern perspective, it's not there because it's less important. I'm talking about the issue of nationality, of citizenship, of belonging to a nation state. And that's something, pardon? That's something certainly less important than your relatives or your group of believers or the people that you grew up with in one particular place. And we're trying hard to find a common denominator that brings the people from Iraq together under one flag, or the people from Palestine, or the people in Kuwait. And it's not easy. What brings all Kuwaitis together, or the Palestinians, as you see here in this case, Mohammed Assaf, are some superficial events like Arab Idol. Here, when this guy from Palestine, from Gaza, won the contest in 2013, Palestinians rallied behind him, leaving behind these differences or these conflicts over political adherent membership in an organization like Hamas or Fatah, or talking about religious division, Jews, Christians, Muslims. We're all Palestinians. We're all texting for Mohammed Assaf to win the competition. Same happened in Iraq, 2007, when they won the Asian football championship. Do you see? That's all. That's what brings Iraqis together. We need to look at events that keep the Iraqis separate from each other. And that's all the other things. These are all the other conflicts, the day-to-day affairs, the security situation, the economic situation, the political fighting. And these things are much more important in the daily lives, in the shaping of the identity, in the shaping of who you belong to, which interest group you support, than having a passport from a particular country. And that's something important to note when we consider patriotism, loyalty, allegiance to a state, not so much to a government, but to a state as an important factor in describing our identity. And I told you about all these young nation states that have been created just a couple decades ago. So there was no time really to build a strong loyalty to the state. And during these few decades that we had, we have to say that the leaders didn't do a good job of promoting these ideas. Yes, we do have citizenship laws in Syria, in Saudi Arabia, and other places in Kuwait as well, but citizenship in most Middle Eastern countries is actually highly controversial and never all-inclusive. So we can't talk of equal citizens in most of these countries. So those who are not part of a first-class citizenship, well, they need to find other ways of participating, of getting along, of getting around, and getting their needs met. I want to walk you through a case, I want to introduce you to a case where we see this lack of institutional, government, societal support actually plays out for the worst. And some of you have heard about the recent events and started in August of last year in northern Iraq when the Islamic State overran a particular area called the Sinjar Mountain. Just, can you wave if you heard about the Sinjar Mountain? Good, this is nice, this is good, you all heard about it. This is great because normally we don't hear much about this particular group, the Yazidi group. They're Kurds, but they're not monotheists in a way that they would be acceptable in the religious spectrum, neither from a Muslim perspective or as what we loosely call as the people of the book. So they're neither, they're nothing of that. They're outsiders. They're ethnic outsiders as Kurds living in a predominantly Arab environment, and they're outsiders from a religious perspective as Yazidis. And to illustrate the misunderstanding or the misconception about this group, some of you heard the nickname that's been given to them by the others. They call them the devil worshippers, which is not a good attribute, especially if you're dealing with religious fanatics like the Islamic State. And then you were aware of what they did, laying siege on the villages and the mountain, killing thousands, plundering, looting, destroying their villages, and more significantly, actually taking hostage some 7,000 Yazidi women and children. And that was under the pretext of some obscure religious doctrine. So just to keep that in mind, we have communities that do not fit in. And they have no place in the larger picture of a citizenship law in countries like Syria or Iraq, or they have to fight for their right to be recognized as a minority, as a protected minority. And I'm happy to answer some question later about this particular group, but I just want you to be aware of that we're not talking about equal citizenship, we're not talking about equal communities, and we're talking more about a hierarchy, about a structure, a ladder, a food chain, if you want to say so, with some groups on top, and then you go down, and if you reach the bottom, you might meet the Yazidis. And these hierarchies are also ancient. These are established a long time ago. And the creation of nation state did not help, did not change that position. And we were hoping that the Arab Spring would change that. But what we know is the Arab Spring now becoming the Arab Fall, it didn't do the trick. So we're still talking about certain groups that have no chance, or they don't have the ability to rise and among the ranks of the different communities, the different societies in the country. They will always be at the bottom of society. And here are some thoughts, some challenges for a community like this who has been ostracized and has been outlawed by their neighbors, has no way of fitting in. And you see that there are some regional implications. In Sinjar, that's the mountain where they lived. You are familiar with the struggle over the city of Kobani in Syria that had a large Yazidi minority group as well. We talk about external influences over that group in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and I put Germany there for a particular reason, because if you don't fit in, you don't have too many options. If you don't fit in, the most practical step is actually to go. Especially if you're at the bottom of the society, you might think about rebelling against the authorities, but we know how that worked with the Kurds, in particular in the Kurdish history. And if you can't do that, you go away, you walk away, you emigrate. And that's what most Yazidis did. They actually emigrated to Germany. So that's where we have the largest immigrant population outside of the Middle East in that country. And to illustrate that on the map again one more time, when we look at the map, it seems at the first place that this is a sectarian map. And this is how we describe usually the events in Iraq. Until recently, we talked about this threefolding of the map, or this perhaps even partitioning of the country into along sectarian, ethno-sectarian lines. Here, a Shia-dominated area, in the middle, a Sunni-dominated area, and then in the north, the Kurdish-dominated area. But you see, we use different attributes already. We use Shia, Sunni, and we use Kurds. Here, sectarian, there, ethnic. And if you extend that into Syria, it gets even more complicated, because the picture, the mosaic of the variety of ethnic and religious majorities is even larger so in that part of the world. And then we have the centerpiece of all evil right now. When we're trying to understand the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq, in Syria, recently in Libya, and in other places, there have been expressions of support and loyalty in places in Yemen, Palestine, Tunisia, Morocco, Western nations as well. We know there's a lot of foreign influx as well, foreign fighters. And now the Islamic State does something kind of smart when they're trying to consolidate power and create a new nation state, but a nation state based on a religious affiliation, so some sort of a sectarian state. And we do have examples in the Middle East where some governments, some countries try to build their ideology as a state around a religious theme. And I try to be rather vague about that, but you probably can tell what country I'm talking about. Israel, Iran, Afghanistan, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia. Well, actually quite a few, right? But here, what we see, it's exclusively. It's an exclusive sectarian religious affiliation, allegiance to an Islamic state. Yes, we do have countries like the Islamic Republic of Iran, but if you study their different political institutions, it's not all sectarian. There are many things that are secular, even based on Western law. Their understanding of the code, of the legal code, how they do things, what's right, what's wrong, is often based on outside sources. Sharia plays a role, but it's not the only role. And so we need to, of course, distinguish between a nation state that has a combination of ideologies and legal systems versus this one that tries to be Islamic Sharia only. Where does it lead us? Where do we go from here? I described to you a picture that has two important, at least two things that I want you to take home tonight. First thing, think about the diversity. Think about each state does have a majority in terms of the ethnic and the religious affiliation, but has a myriad of different interpretation of that religion, has a myriad of different ethnic groups, and often struggles with that concept of how to treat minorities, or how does the minority in charge treat the majority. So this is something important to consider also when you put that together with the aspect of the core identity. So it's not the nation state that your ultimate allegiance, your ultimate loyalty should go, but to something much closer to the heart. So we talk about this from a sectarian perspective. It's certainly closer than the state affiliation, than the nationality, but something closer to the heart, to the core, would be the kinship. And so then you keep in mind that political borders in the current Middle East, this is the map here, excuse me, yeah, that's the map here on the left, is actually built on something different, something alien, something new, that people have very little experience with. And then you look at what's possible, what might happen in the future that looks like this. And I did not come up with that map, but it was circulated a couple of years ago as a future scenario for the Middle East, that maybe our understanding of political stability is no longer accurate. It should be updated. Maybe we should redraw, we should think about redrawing political borders. And when I say we, I don't mean the West. I mean people from the Middle East. They should have a saying in that, what's appropriate for them, how would they like to see certain territories carved out for interest groups, an interest group that belongs to a particular interpretation of the law, interpretation of the religion, or an ethnic minority, all with the idea that maybe if you make a good cause, if you make a good case, and you say, well, we provide for a certain identity, a group, a very coherent, cohesive identity, then we do have the right to our own state as well. Think about what we did in Bosnia, what we did in Kosovo, in other places as well. Certainly there was a large degree of foreign intervention and foreign indoctrination of that concept. But it's possible to think about a country like Saudi Arabia that has some internal divisions, where we know people in the center, in the Najd, think differently, dress differently, read different things, express their religion differently than people in the Hijaz. So, but that move, I mean, this was a move that did not come out of the Middle East, that came out of the sandbox of the games that the generals played. But it's certainly worthwhile thinking about it. And then listen to what people from the region at Najd or in Hijaz or in Asir or in other places in Saudi Arabia think. And that's probably also my critique here with this map, that we focus so much on particular states and leave out others. There's nothing here, there's no talk about Egypt. Turkey actually got a significant loss, and we actually incorporated another country. We incorporated Kurdistan, a Kurdish state just for the Kurds. It would be an accomplishment that is based on the will, on the interest of the people on the ground. And so that brings me back to wrap that up in my discussion of answering that question, if it's religion, if it's sectarian, or it's political. And as I said earlier, it's neither. It has a lot to do with identities, with a clash of identities, that people need to figure out what's the most important, the closest thing that they can rely on, they can trust, they can seek refuge, they can seek support with, and then creating something around the core identity and not something artificial or superficial like a nationality or a passport that has very little weight in their opinion. With that, thank you very much for your opinion, and I'm ready to take some questions.
We're going to start. We're going to start the Q&A portion. If anybody has a question, you can do it two ways. One is there's a mic over there, as well as where I'm standing, obviously, and you can come down and ask the question yourself. Or right now, Mark is going to be putting up the slide that has a cell phone number on that can be text questions to. and we'll take your questions by text as well. There's a lot of ways you can do that. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to come on down.
Hi. What do you think the chances of a Kurdistan coming into existence is, realistically?
Realistically, well, first, what I think about having a state for the Kurds is probably something different than what the reality would tell the political reality will tell us. Kurds have often been described as the losers of World War I, not getting their own state, where so many other interest groups actually got their state. Some particular groups even got more than one state. Some would argue, yes, it's time. And in particular, right now, if we're looking for allies in the Middle East, so we do have a group that is ready to support us, that is ready to receive support in their claim for more than just autonomy. But we also need to keep history in mind. I mean, this is now a period over 80, 90 years that Kurds struggle in various ways of getting various things. When some say autonomy is just enough, others say, well, we want more than autonomy, we want maybe a federal system, or we want our own state. And so the Kurds don't know what they want. As a whole, yes, there are these local expressions, and we know we have a very good example of what's going on in Iraq right now. And Barzani actually he uses the word independence, but I think he does use it more in order to frighten his partners in Baghdad than actually accomplishing an independent state. Plus, then we wouldn't know who would rule that country, who will be in charge, because now we know of different Kurdish identities. We can't really talk about the Kurds as one bloc. We know that the Kurds in Turkey have different priorities and different worries and different grievances than the Kurds in Syria or in Iran. And so when I'm hopeful, at one time, I think more realistically, it's to say that we will not see a free, independent Kurdish state within the next 10 years.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing. I have, my question has to do with, my question has to do with the development of, like, the Reformation, the religious background that you talked about, and like the Reformation, when the Roman Catholic Church started to proliferate and change into all the different Lutherans and all the different groups that sprung from during the Reformation, and then, of course, in the formation of our country in terms of the political. Well, Rhode Island was formed because, I can't remember, it's been decades. Roger, somebody?
Thank you.
Anyways, he separated from the group and went to Rhode Island and started a group there. And so the different political splintering in our own country. And then we came together. Mm-hmm. I mean, but what we had, the crux, the glue to bring it together in terms of the nation state. We have the Greek and the Romans as our, that we could draw upon. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Arabs and the Middle East, it's more tribal. And so they don't have the history that we had for our country.
Well, I thank you for this comment and trying to find or trying to compare the Middle Eastern experience, even the historical experience, with some different areas, different scenarios. First, quick answer: yes, they do have experience. They do have a history. They do have a history. The Middle East has a history of creating states, of creating empires, of governing empires, mostly with a religious undertone. Just think about the Caliphate. Caliphate ended just less than 100 years ago. And now we do have a new Caliphate. So the idea is not novel. The idea is not novel to the Middle East. And could you repeat your question? So I try to, where were you trying to go with your thought? Are you saying that that when we have a tribal society, the tribal societies cannot turn into a nation state, because citizenship then is based on certain primordial alliances by birth, by blood? Cannot. Cannot adjust. Well, I'm a strong supporter of tribal ties, and especially in times of conflict. And what we've seen over the past decades right now is a lot of conflict. And perhaps many areas in the Middle East didn't have the time to develop this sense of citizenship, of nationality, because of those conflicts. You need you need an idea to gather around and to support, but you also need some time to develop it, to consolidate it.
I'm going to read a couple questions. Actually, there's several coming in here about the financial aspect of creating the new identity that were on the maps. Because oil is at stake and the large economic impact at stake, how would we expect states to be willing to balkanize themselves in order to fit ethnic and religious lines? And how economically feasible is that piece?
Viability of a country depends on resources, depends on certain assets. And as we know, what are the assets of the state of Kosovo? Which I was very much in favor of, creating something safe, something secure, something independent for a particular interest group. What's the viability of a future Palestinian state? What do they have to grow? They need foreign support, they need outside support. What would it be if we finally get a free Kurdistan and independent Kurdistan? The Iraqi Kurds are in the lucky situation that they do have some oil, but so many other groups are not. And I think that basing your plan, your vision of a future state on numbers, on assets, is certainly an issue of viability, but certainly nothing that will actually get you support of the masses, who you want to have an ideology, you want to have a vision, you want to have a certain identity for that state that's not necessarily tied to a resource, to a single resource like oil or something else.
Hello. In Tunisia, the youth population is fleeing to fight in ISIS, mainly because of like economic woes and this identity crisis, not really having a place to go. Do you think that, well, first off, do you think that a secular and Islamist bipartisan government is possible in Tunisia? And if so, what role would identity play in achieving this goal?
A secular Islamist...
like Nida Tunis and Ennahda working together.
I think the experiment in Tunisia, what we're seeing right now, is exactly that we have certain moderate forces, moderate groups from the entire spectrum, starting with some secularists, some women movements, some unions, some youth movements, working together with what we might label as moderate Islamists. So it seems to work, at least on a political, ideological level. Is this economically feasible? The country has certain dependencies on tourism, and they don't have any major resources. Yeah. But if you provide some sort of stability again, and if you can show the world that the main segments of societies are able and willing to work together, that's been attractive to the tourists, to the investors, to the international community. So I think this is actually, here we have one of the few examples, one of the positive examples where it actually works.
Thank you.
I'd like to touch again on redrawing the boundaries. Do you think that the countries, the affected ones, the Middle Eastern countries, actually can redraw the boundaries without the Western countries, Europe, U.S., even China and Russia, being the ones who are actually drawing the boundaries again, since they drew them the first time?
I'm sorry to say you answered the question actually yourself pretty well. Realistically, this is, of course, not on the agenda. And how can we do that? Others then through a revolution, perhaps. But we've seen where revolutions got us. What did Libya show us? I mean, now we got rid of the central government and we relied back on some old ancient identities and loyalty groups. I don't think it's possible. But it's something that people actively think about it, and they know exactly what happened 100 years ago when their countries were designed. But the discussion could continue and keep it up, keep this discussion going. I mean, the West creates new countries. So perhaps that approach, if they really want to be successful, should be by incorporating or getting some allies, some major allies and supporters. But realistically, from the ground, it's impossible.
You talked about national identity not playing as big of a role as, for instance, tribe identity. Mm-hmm. Yet recently, we had Jordan as well as Egypt react to ISIS in a very nationalistic way. Mm-hmm. Does that bind them together? Does that draw them together as a nation? How, if nationalism is not necessarily as high up there, they reacted quite nationalistic in their latest moves.
What we've seen in the news, in the media, on social media, on Twitter, and so they're trying to show that the entire country is behind that decision. And I think they have a good case. They can make a good case here because there was this tragic event, or these two tragic events, and for the moment, since this struck with the population of these two countries, actually it went to the core of their identity. One of theirs, several of their people were hurt, and so there was this need for revenge. I doubt, given the number of supporters for the other side, that this has a lasting aspect, actually will ever last for quite a while. So it might do it for the moment, but with some sort of a mandatory reaction to show this demonstration of strength. Because if you don't, well, you appear weak in the eyes of everyone else. But you demonstrate some strength, and then it gets you some temporary relief, some temporary support, but I doubt that this will actually increase the popularity or somehow relieve some of the grievances that the masses in Jordan have against the royal family or against the president in Egypt.
Thank you. So in terms of building that identity that's so important, what role does civil society play in that? And is there a role for the West to be involved at all, or is that has to be domestically grown?
Civil society is something that grows slowly, that needs to be nurtured, that needs to develop, grow in some sort of a safe and stable environment. It also needs to be supported from the top somehow and has large-scale mass or grassroots support. We thought that the Arab Spring would do that it goes peaceful and some sort of a smooth transition into what the people actually demanded. These first demands in the Arab Spring, they were okay. There wasn't too much. They didn't ask for maximum things for regime change. They asked for some modest economic policies to change, to improve the livelihood, and to ask perhaps for more local participation. And so we were on a good track, actually, to see the growth of civil society in several Arab states. But we also need to consider that politics and rule and decision-making in I'd say in most, and we can argue about certain cases, but in most Middle Eastern countries is from top down, and that the larger society is little involved in any of the decision making. And so now the Arab Spring being crashed, I think it was a setback for the establishment of new institution for civil society. The West tried to intervene. We tried to bring democracy. We tried to teach Middle Easterners. We tried to teach Egyptians, Moroccans, Lebanese, communities, societies, organizations, the way how we do politics, the way how we organize elections. And we reached certain elements of society, an element that was already more modern, more open to Western ideas. But we failed, I feel like, we failed to reach the masses that were not part of that stream.
To follow up on the Egyptian and Jordanian question, how do ordinary citizens relate to these victims? I believe the Libyan victims were all Christians, so are they seen as outsiders among Egyptians, or are they kind of citizens of an entire state?
We need to go back one step when we say how are Copts viewed in Egypt. And this brings back this level of hierarchy, of segmentation of societies, that you belong to a certain interest group that is not part of the larger establishment. And when we look at the Copts in Egypt from this perspective, then we see that they are not treated in the same way as the mainstream society, the elites of society. But having a tragic event like the killing of those 21 Christians, that again can serve as a rally point for the community. And yes, as Egyptian, you feel hurt as an Egyptian. You feel attacked as an Egyptian. But that's what the president said. He didn't talk about 21 Copts being killed. He talked about 21 Egyptians being killed. And so the response was then, we need to take revenge for Egyptian lives being lost and not for Christians. It did not improve the lot of the Copts in Cairo and Alexandria, but it had a certain immediate reaction showing the Egyptian people that there is someone who cares for them at large. And why do we have Christians in Libya anyway? What were the Egyptian Christians doing in Libya? They left their country in search for better living conditions. So I think it's they've been used some sort of as a PR scapegoat.
There's a couple questions here about unity. One having to do with the Arab League. Do you think that has been unifying at all? And then secondly, do you think that these countries can rally behind a unity perhaps in the Arabic language?
I like that question. It's a very good question. And whoever sent the question did their homework well, because we just had this simulation for the Arab League at Grand Valley on the weekend. So where we've seen students representing each country of the Arab League and taking some sort of a diplomatic stand, representing a country, being a strong supporter of the politics, the policies of this country, and then trying to find common ground and debate issues, bilateral, international issues at the Arab League, which is a very good tool, learning tool, actually to for students of foreign relations, different languages, different cultures. And one of the most difficult things that students experienced in that model was to stay in character, to truly represent the country and not represent their belief or their perceptions. And if we look at the Arab League today, uniting some 22 Arab nations, a variety of countries from Djibouti, Mauritania, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, to a degree, and finding some common ground. The idea was born when the ethnic identity, the Arabic element, the Arab element, this pan-Arab element, was actually the word of the day, was the strong focus, that the rally point for people in the region. But we learned that it's not just about politics, and it's not just about ethnicity. We know there are other factors. And yes, we need to add a little bit of sectarianism here. We need to add a little bit of tribalism there. But the Arab League proved to be, in many ways, incapable of dealing with domestic, internal league affairs, responding in a way that was valued by all members. They rather tend to camp up in certain areas, so we have a certain group of countries representing one ideology over the other. Going back to the idea that we might see a new Cold War breaking out within the Middle East. So I think the idea of the Arab League is not dead, but in order to become an active stakeholder or to prove to be an actor of accomplishing something, the Arab League needs to reform itself. The notion of Arabic as the unifying factor for all Arabs has been dismissed a long time ago. Yes, we say, what makes an Arab an Arab? Is it the language? Is it just linguistics? Well, raise your hand if you learn Arabic. There are some Arabic students here, I know that. A few, and you know the difficulty of using Arabic as a vehicle of communication throughout the Arab world, where we rather deal with local expressions, with dialects, with colloquial forms, and then even among those dialects and colloquial forms, there's a certain hierarchy, so they are not equal in terms of their reputation, in terms of their status. And there's a lot of dislike, disharmony among the Arabs, and the way you speak actually expresses that. So I don't think that Arabic can serve as that unifying tool anymore.
Hi. So, So you brought up a diagram earlier which showed like factions of specific groups, such as like Kurds tied to like specific nation states, maybe. So Kurds with like Turkey. My question was, we'll use Kurds for an example. So say that a Kurd from Iraq, well, what they want essentially is essentially what a Kurd from Turkey wants. They want in some ways, the basic concept is they want a Kurdish state. They may have different views, but ultimately they both want a Kurdish state. My question is, don't they have like somewhat of a, what Rawls would call an overlapping consensus, which ties the two together to create a beneficial outcome, even though their backgrounds are different? So I guess what I'm saying is, what's going to tie a Kurd from Iraq to a Kurd from Turkey, even though they're different, but they both want the same state? At what point does it become identity supersedes the issue of the state, or vice versa, is what I'm asking.
If I hear you correctly, Jake, you're trying to find this denominator that brings all the Kurds, that rallies all the Kurds behind the idea of a Kurdish state for all Kurds. Mm-hmm. We play our layers of identity when it's opportune to us. It's not like this is a very stable layering system. We wear the hat when we need it. And if we need to wear the hat of ethnicity in order to achieve something, well, then we use that. But the only thing that we need to left out from that is our core. The core identity is something that's always been there, we always defend. But other levels of citizenship, ethnicity, things can change. Things can change. And under the current circumstances, the current system that we have, there is no such a thing as one common theme among the Kurds, except being part of a group of victims. But that's not enough in order to create an ideology that would lead to statehood. Victimization, well, we have many victims groups. Yeah, but Kurds from Iraq, some Kurds from Iraq, they don't know. There is no such a thing. There are Kurds in Iraq who openly speak about secession from Baghdad, and others said, no, we need to stay because we have no chance to survive as an individual country. And then others say, well, what if we bring in our friends from Syria, from Iran and Turkey? But it's highly speculative. And, but the conversation is worthwhile following because we need to be aware that there are other identity groups, other stories that need to be heard. So, but I don't think that we, I truly don't think that there is one common Kurdish movement for a singular Kurdish state right now.
One last question.
Yeah, I have an interest in some of the minority sects that I think you know about. The Alawites in Syria, for example, and the Alevi, as they're referred to in Turkey, are they in fact the same sect? And if you could comment on them and perhaps the Assyrians and the Chaldeans.
Good question. And first question, no, they're not the same. Basically, the distinction we make is on their ethnic origin. Alawis are usually Turks, Kurdish, while the Alawis are Arab. And so they have a different genesis, a different origin in terms of emerging in this part of Syria versus in the part of Turkey. Alawis, the Syrian Alawis, they actually came from Egypt at one time, 11th century, marched up north, while the Kurdish Alawis, they actually stem from some Sufi movements in the 12th, 13th century, coming more from the Kurdish areas. So they actually happen to meet and being very close to each other, but they're certainly, they want to make sure, and they do make sure that they are not being mistaken as the same. And we say that, for example, Assad is an Alawi, and we know Öcalan is an Alevi, but they don't want to be called the same thing. So Alevism is more of is much more closer to the Sufi movement, while the Alawi movement is much closer to, if you want to say, a Shia movement. What was your second question?
The Assyrians and the Chaldeans.
Assyrian. I recently attended a workshop on minorities in the Middle East, and the discussion did not spun about different entities, the different groups, but more about the concept of minorities. And so the common discussion or the common theme was that minorities are actually created. The idea of minority is something new. They always exist, but they've been created in order to prove some other agendas that we need to have a certain, we need to carve out a political an entity and take away something from an otherwise cohesive majority or communities, like what the Syrians did what the French did in Syria during the Mandate period, giving actually more clout, more rights to those otherwise rather secondary in the hierarchy, lower ranked minority groups. Assyrians have, well, they lived in the area for thousands of years. We know that. They needed to come up with a response to the rise of nationalism in Iraq, in Turkey, and in some of the Caucasus republics, Syria to a degree as well. And they needed to come up with a response to the rise of Islamism. And as such, they tried both, I feel like in Iraq, in the case of Iraq, and it both failed them. So for them, they're in this precarious situation, similar to what I described about the Yazidis in Iraq, that they do not really fit in. Iraq, in its conception, was not a state for the Assyrian Christians. Neither was it for the Yazidis. So for them, they struggle. That's how I interpret their actions, their representations, their documents. They struggle to accept, to find a place in that state of Iraq. One more question, gentlemen?
You want one more? Okay, one quick question.
It seems to me that when we get rid of authoritarian type government, that we have not been able to get the leadership in to replace them, to handle or be interested in uniting the various segments together, and what can we as the West or what to help develop leadership in these countries that will take over, and what can we do to support the kind of leaders that we want that will unite and treat equally and fairly these various groups.
That is a very noble goal, and I'm not saying that sarcastically. Actually, I think this. You think about it this way. I think about it this way. That we want to help, right?
Yeah.
We want to support, but who do we support? Are we selective in terms of our support? Are we supporting every group, or are we picking those who are closest to our identity level? So it's tricky. In the past, it failed us too many times. That's why I argue that some sort taking a step back and trying to be less vocal, less active. I mean, that's just my opinion when I look at foreign involvement, and in many ways, foreign involvement actually intensifies conflict rather than de-escalates conflict.
That's true.
And but there is no blueprint for that. I mean, we need to distinguish between smaller countries, larger groups, political alliances, national interests that are here and there. But as a rule of thumb, doing less is sometimes better.
Okay.
A very complex situation remains complex, but perhaps what we have been certainly informed this evening, and perhaps what we've learned is that maybe we need to do less. Maybe we shouldn't be so sure that we do understand what's going on in this complex situation in the Middle East. So please join me in thanking again Dr. Mazel for his presentation.
Thank you, Linda.
If you'd like to continue discussions, remember that join Kathy Dopp at the Sheshko Mediterranean Grill up on Cinema North and continue that. And next week, join us again for the event which will be dealing with human trafficking in our own backyard. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.